What were Canada's Christians hearing from their pulpits on the Sunday after the federal election? On the feature today, some samples.
God orders human history, and he uses secular rulers to maintain order in society, whether those people believe it or not.
The master of Prime Minister designate Justin Trudeau is God, not us.
We should be trusting the Lord to work in and through our Canadian government. Regardless of what beliefs they hold, we trust God.
In the news, an ARPA chapter in BC has sparked a community debate over funding community infrastructure. The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada is out with a new declaration on euthanasia, and ARPA is hiring again.
And now, Lighthouse News. Lighthouse News is a presentation of ARPA, the Association for Reform Political Action. Here's your host, Al Sebring.
You may have heard of a move in BC. It started in Vancouver, where municipalities are getting on board with so-called gay rights by painting rainbow sidewalks on their streets. The movement has expanded to several communities since Vancouver did it, including the small town of Smithers in northern BC. The Bulkley Valley chapter of ARPA got involved in the discussion there, initially registering its objection to the idea and then engaging with the town council with some suggestions. One of the chapter members suggested a motion for council to also create a sidewalk honoring the pro-life cause. Ruth Bradenhoff is with that ARPA chapter. She says they got a bunch of people to turn up at a council meeting where this was supposed to be discussed.
There was a lot of people supporting it in the audience, and they knew that. So they discussed the rainbow crosswalk. They kind of ignored the pro-life one, and in question period after the person that wrote the letter asked them why they didn't vote on it, and they said one of the town councillors would actually have to propose it as a motion, but they decided not to do that.
Even though on the surface at least the effort failed, the rainbow sidewalk is staying. Bradenhoff says there were some real benefits that flowed from this engagement.
It's been a very good experience actually, because it's made us really think about the issue ourselves. It made us think through things like we should think more about having people on town council that do have a Christian perspective. Also, a lot of people have been speaking with their town councillors and they haven't done that otherwise. And we also think more about the fact that we are trying to win others for Christ, not just trying to win specific issues or come across that we're trying to get our way.
The issue continues to prompt some community discussion in Smithers. Nationally, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada has released a new declaration on euthanasia and assisted suicide. Policy analyst Julia Beasley says the document, which has been signed by leading evangelicals and Catholics, as well as representatives from the Jewish and Muslim communities, calls on governments to do three things in the wake of the Carter decision on this issue.
We ask that the government, both the federal and the provincial territorial governments, would enact and uphold laws that enhance human solidarity by promoting the rights to life and security for all people. We asked that the governments work to make sure that good quality home care and palliative care is accessible to all people, and to implement regulations and policies that make sure we respect the freedom of conscience for all healthcare workers and administrators.
As to whether this idea will get any traction with the new government, Beasley is somewhat optimistic. She says doing nothing on this file isn't really an option for the new Prime Minister, and a lot of people are expecting the government to ask the Supreme Court for an extension to the February deadline for rewriting the criminal code.
We are certainly hopeful that that is how things will go, and we are hopeful that the new government will take advantage of that time, if it's granted, to really engage in some deep, meaningful consultation. And, in terms of doing nothing, I think the Supreme Court made it clear that the federal government doing nothing was not really an option. They made these allowances, but they also made it clear that there would need to be very strict restrictions and guidelines and regulations and procedures put around this.
The declaration is online. You can add your signature. We've got a link to it from the Lighthouse News homepage. And finally, ARPA is hiring again. We're advertising for two positions. Executive Director Mark Penninga says the first is an addition, an admin assistant in the We Need a Law office.
Currently, it's been Nikki Pennings who's been providing all of our administrative needs for both ARPA and We Need a Law, and her role keeps growing. She's managing so many events from across the country, on top of everything from our communications to our interactions with the local ARPA groups. So it was clear to us we need to add someone on staff to help Nikki out.
The deadline for applications on that position is November 17th. They'd prefer someone who lives in the Fraser Valley, near where We Need a Law Director Mike Schutten is located. The other position is more technical. literally. Nate Bosher has been ARPA's webmaster and IT head for a number of years, but he's getting married, moving, and starting a new job in January. So Penninga says they're looking for a replacement in a somewhat expanded position.
We're changing the title from webmaster to both the web developer, but also an e-activist, like an electronic activist. So then the focus is on looking at what ARPA and We Need a Law are doing and developing tools so that everybody is able to interact with this work from their own homes in simple ways. So things like our EasyMail technology is the model we want to develop in much bigger and broader ways.
Ideally, Mark says they'd like to fill that slot by mid-December to allow some overlap time. The job isn't really limited by geography. It can be done from anywhere, but they'd really like someone who could spend some time in ARPA's Ottawa office. Back with more after this.
In the next week, Stephen Harper will officially step down as Prime Minister. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau will be sworn in as Canada's 23rd Prime Minister, and the Conservative caucus will start the process of appointing an interim leader. Please take time to be in prayer for those elected to lead our country, for wisdom from God, and for humility in these important positions. Now would also be a good time to reach out to your newly elected representative and let them know you are praying for them, and begin to build relationships with those God has placed in office.
And we're back on the program. The federal election is now a few weeks behind us, but we thought it'd be interesting to do some digging around on the web to see what kind of reaction the election precipitated from the country's pulpits on October 25th, the Sunday immediately following the election. So on the feature today, some short clips from 3 sermons that were preached that Sunday. We've got links to 2 of them from the Lighthouse News homepage. First of all, Reverend Abel Pole of the Canadian Reformed Churches preaching in Yarrow, BC. The sermon was ostensibly on the 5th commandment, the notion of honoring our father and mother, and by extension, showing respect for authority.
We read from Romans 13 today, and there was no exception clause there. There is no way to get out of that command. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. In the 5th commandment, God calls us to honor his authority. Why do we need to submit to authority? The first reason is in verse 1. He's talking about the government here, and he says there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. The most famous biblical example is Isaiah 44, verse 27, which says that God tells the exiles that the heathen King Cyrus is, quote, my shepherd, and he does all that I please, end quote. So God orders human history. He is the God of all humanity, all society, and he uses secular rulers to maintain order in that society, whether those people believe it or not. And we need to keep this in mind also in light of last week's elections. Whatever else you might think about our present government and prime minister, the fact is, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, they rule by his right.
Another sermon that referenced Romans 13 was preached at Providence Free Reformed Church in St. George, Ontario, by Derek Bars.
It is essential that we understand God's purpose, his expectations for government. And we are called then to align our desires and our efforts with what God directs government to do in his word. Those who are in authority have a positive function. We see it throughout the text, but especially in verse 4. Paul says there, for he, the government, is God's minister to you for good. Though the government rules over the citizens, and though the citizens elect the government of their country, where there's a democracy, each person in the government, or each person who works for the government in various capacities, is a minister or a servant of God. Doesn't that radically shift the way that the government should view itself and the way that we should view our government? Though they have a position of power and authority, they are God's servants. That means that the master of Prime Minister designate Justin Trudeau is God, not us. Not the people who voted all these people into office, but the Lord. They are his servants. And so they need to know that they are accountable to God for their thoughts, their words, their actions. And it is both our duty and our responsibility to tell them about this. Perhaps somebody might respond at this point, I understand that's what the Bible says, but the reality is so different. We live under leaders who don't acknowledge the God of the Bible. In response to these objections, I would say it's true. There's a great gap between the biblical direction and the reality that we experience today. But this was true in Paul's day as well. Do you know who might have been emperor when Paul wrote these words to the Romans? It's possible that it was Nero who was the emperor. And yet it was Nero who had been placed in authority in order to be God's minister, God's servant for good to the citizens of the empire. That's the standard by which Nero and every leader, yes, Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Designate Trudeau, every leader, past, present, and future, will be judged. Were they or were they not God's servant, God's minister for good?
But it wasn't just Reformed churches that touched on this subject. In Chemainus, BC, Reverend Edgar Unruh, the pastor at Calvary Baptist Church, used the first 6 chapters of Daniel to illustrate the sovereignty of God in political affairs, specifically in the post-election context.
So we today, with our new Liberal government and a new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, let's hear again what God did in Daniel chapter 1 to chapter 6. God changed the ruling government of one nation and put them under an entirely new governing power. God made His children move into positions of authority in that secular, idol-worshipping government. God protected His children from the backlash their actions for God stirred up from the secular government, and He did it in a miraculous way. God removed a king from power, punished him, saved him, and reinstated him into power. God is sovereign over all authority, including every and any government. Therefore, what should we do as God's children? What should we be doing? We should be trusting the Lord to work in and through our Canadian government. Regardless of what beliefs they hold, we trust God. He can change any heart that's in Parliament. He can make any of them His child. He can put any of His children in any position. We don't know what He's up to, but we know what we are to be up to. We are to be trusting God. And it's an active trust, which means we need to care about those around us, so much so that we get involved politically, locally, nationally, being a loving participant in our Canadian society, running for office, being a biblical voice in the issues that arise. Doing what 1 Timothy chapter 2, 1-4 says. Thank God for this government and pray for them. We are called to glorify God by being obedient to the government. Not because you voted for them. That has nothing to do with it. Obey because you are glorifying God and obeying God. 1 Peter 2 verse 17 even says, honor the emperor, the king, the prime minister. Do this to glorify the Lord. So with this new government, with our new prime minister, God can do endless things. Don't forget that. God can do endless things. He can. He softened hearts of officials and kings. He raised up 4 of His children inside an openly idol-worshipping pagan Babylonian empire. What can't He do with Prime Minister Trudeau and our Liberal government? What can't He do? Trust God and pray. Let's be God-glorifying, active citizens involved in the community who obey, pay taxes, pray for, and honor the government leaders, all for the glory of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
Again, we've got links to 2 of these 3 sermons up on the Lighthouse News homepage.
This has been Lighthouse News, delivering news and commentaries on today's current events to equip Christians for their task in the public square. Production Manager Brian Grimm, Technical Director Nate Bosher. Questions or feedback? You can leave us an audio comment by clicking on the answering machine button at the top of the Lighthouse News homepage, or you can send us an email, info@arpaccanada.ca. Be sure to join us again next week for another edition of Lighthouse News. For another edition